I started off the project with these 3 bent pieces of wood that I made myself. I can make a separate video on how I made them. Basically, I put pieces of wood into a steamer for about an hour or more, and then after that I clamped them around a large pot until they dried. But anyway, these will basically serve as forms of legs that I'll be trying to attach onto this main big cylinder of wood using these smaller cylinders, as I show in the video. Here I did a small measurement on the big cylinder so that there's just enough space for the legs to extend, and on the top for the platform that I'll be making. Since the legs are not very uniform and vary in sizes, I placed them next to each other to have the tips of the bottoms aligned, and then I drew a line that will represent the flat part that will be touching the ground once everything is set up. Working on the big cylinder first, I first clamped it onto my vise so that then I could saw it. And once it was cut, I had the final piece that I was going to be working with. I was very happy. Having the big cylinder piece, I measured the distance that I wanted to have between the big cylinder and the bent pieces for the smaller cylinders. I put that measurement 3 times on the small cylinder and then cut the individual pieces. I then had to figure out how to actually place the legs at 120-degree angles, and so I did that by using a watch, by splitting it into 3 parts and then putting a dot at each angle. I then completed the triangle and drew lines from the midpoints to make the center of the triangle. Then I could place the big cylinder into the center and draw the little markings that would represent the 120 degrees, which I'll use for drilling the little holes for the smaller cylinders. With the markings in place, I drew straight lines with a ruler for all 3 sides. With the horizontal measurements, I added the vertical one, which represents the height at which the legs will be held at. And I drew it all the way around the circumference of the cylinder. Next up, I had to figure out how to attach the small cylinder pieces to these curved ones, like so. After aligning the curved leg pieces, I drew a line in the middle that will represent where the cylinders will be attached, and also drew the marking all the way around the piece. Going back to the small cylinder pieces, I wanted to drill a small hole for each one for the screw to go inside, and so I clamped them, made a small mark with a pencil, and then drilled the hole and repeated that process for all 3 pieces. I'm also using a screw here with a hammer as a sort of center punch so that it makes it easier to drill in the exact spot that you want to. I drew the same type of hole in all 3 legs so that the screw would go through and into this small cylinder. Then came the part that I had a few problems with. So I tried first screwing in the screw through the leg and then directly into the small cylinder, and I realized that it was requiring way too much force to screw in. And so I had to make a few modifications because I thought that the screw would break and that it just was way too tight for it. And so for that I drilled a slightly larger hole in the leg, and with the same drill bit I also drilled in a little bit into the small cylinder so that there would be a little bit of less tension, so that it would grab a little bit after. And here with the new hole for the leg, you can see that the screw can easily just go in and out, which makes it easier. It'll just be held by the pressure. And then I repeated the same process and tried screwing the screw in again. But then something completely unexpected happened. The screw simply snapped. It broke. I put too much pressure on it, and so I had to think of something else. While I was trying to blame as much as I can the screw on the failure rather than my own design, I tried fixing the little cylinder that I had by drilling inside. But then I, of course, drilled through the side of it, and so it was no longer usable, and I had to make a new one. But instead, I tried the same exact thing on another cylinder and another leg. So I made some modifications to the cylinder. I had a little bit more space than I did last time, and then I tried screwing it again. This time everything seemed to be going well, and so I tried screwing it in just a little bit more just to get it finished, and it broke. Now I was pretty determined, so I tried again and it worked a third time without breaking after making even more sophisticated modifications. And then I made 2 more of the short cylinders and applied the same modifications as I did to the last one. I also made little indents with a large drill bit. I know that this is not the correct one, that this is a metal one, but I think in this scenario it works well. So I screwed everything in again, and in the end I had 3 nice legs with the short cylinders attached. So now I could start working on the big cylinder. But before I started to drill any holes for the small cylinders, I had to figure out how far they would need to go in, and so I did a very precise setup and made a small measurement, and I put that measurement on the drill bit using a piece of tape so that I know how far I can go in. And with the initial hole in place, I started drilling with larger and larger drill bits to make the largest hole I could make that the small cylinder would fit in. Now this last drill bit clearly didn't work out for me at first, but then eventually it did. Then I tried to put one of the legs, well, one of the small cylinders inside of that hole, and I realized that it didn't really work. I had to make something that was slightly bigger. And so over the course of the next other drills, I drilled a lot with the last drill bit around as much as I could. But then anyway, I continued on making the rest of the 2 other holes. Here's a clip of me desperately trying to get a test cylinder inside. And the last 3rd hole completed with the largest drill bit. Here's what I ended up with. I had the large cylinder with 3 holes, and as you can see the holes go in and through each other and makes a sort of cavity, but I thought that's okay because all of the small cylinders go inside anyway, and the small cylinders also seem to fit in snugly and well. I erased the rest of the little markings that I made on the big cylinder so that doesn't show. And then off camera I briefly constructed the legs. Well, I attached the legs to the big cylinder to show how it would look like, and it seemed to hold well even without glue or anything. I mean, of course I'll put glue later, but yeah, the general structure held. It stayed on its legs. It didn't really survive the the force, the punching stress test. So yeah, I was happy with that result. Now at this point it has been a while since I worked on the project and I changed phones, so it'll look a little bit different. But basically what I first did was I enlarged the holes with my rotary tool, my Dremel, using a little circular sanding bit just to make them a bit bigger. And for a little demonstration, you can see the small cylinder basically goes to the end of the hole inside the big cylinder, so it uses as much space as possible. Alright, so the final step, I have to figure out how to make the top platform, the circular platform. So I'll be using this homemade jig that I made. I'll explain how I use it later, I'll show it. But first, I set up the stand as much as I could and made a little measurement using a roll of tape that would represent the circumference of the top part that I want to make. Then I cut around the measurement, making a square that's a little slightly larger, and that I'll use in the jig. Then I made a measurement on my jig for the radius of the circle that I want to make with regards to the slit where the blade will be. At that measurement, I drilled a small hole, so then I could, when I flip around the board, I can put my nail with a piece of wood so that it doesn't stick out too much, and then hammer it all the way through. So now I have a little piece of nail protruding from the board. And so my goal now is to set up a center for the piece of wood so that I can put it inside and so that it can rotate. I made a new measurement for the center of the square just to make sure that it's as even as possible, because the circle that I made before was not as accurate. And then I made a small indent with a drill bit. And then I used that indent so that I could place it on the tip of the nail. And it's a few verifications on the size of it and whether it all fits. It was a little bit tight, but eventually it worked. And I finally fixed it into place. And now the square piece rotates freely around it, and if the blade is right at the end and I rotate it around, then it'll cut the circle at the radius that I chose. So if you have noticed on my jig on the sides, there are these ridges. It's these thin pieces of wood that I glued and nailed into the board, so that then I can slide it into my jigsaw onto the sides, that's completely for something else, so that it holds it in place so it doesn't rotate. Then I realized that I have a small problem, as you can see here, because the piece of wood, the extra piece of wood that holds the nail so that it doesn't surpass, it doesn't go too high, is actually blocked by the base of the jigsaw, and so I can't push it in because it's way too thick. With a little bit of work off camera, I replaced that thicker piece of wood with these thin wooden boards, so it's still short enough so it doesn't pierce through the whole square of wood. I hammered it inside once more. And once again I made another mistake because I put the nail on the wrong side, and so it wouldn't fit. The slit that's for the blade won't fit, and so I had to redo it again and just flip the nail. And now I could finally slide it inside with a little bit of force, and the thin pieces of wood that I had were small enough so I can just angle up a little bit and it'll just stand on the base of the jigsaw. So I set up the little plastic piece that stops the whole piece of wood from wobbling or from moving up and down, and then I started cutting, rotating the square all the way around until I had the final circle. And then I finally had it. It's not the best circle, it's not perfect at all, but hey, it fit on top of the thing. But yeah, I still had to do a little bit of work with this circle before I could actually glue it. So to fix the circle a little bit, I used my Dremel with the same sanding bit that I used before to just even out the rough edges and to make it look more like a circle, to make it more round. Something else that I also wanted to modify was that when I placed the circle on top, that it would just hit the legs at the corner, since the circle is a little bit larger, and it wouldn't go all the way to touch the tip of that large cylinder in the back, as you can see. And so I made these 3 little dips in the circle, so that it can slide in easily and make contact with the top part of the cylinder, which will make it a lot easier to attach to it. Now if you notice on the top over there, I'll mark it, there's a little part that sticks out that, oh, well, now it's covered by my hair. There's a little part that sticks out through the, from the top of the circle. It's visible from the top, and I didn't like that because I overdid it with my Dremel. And so I made some homemade wood filler. I basically mixed some of the wood dust, the sawdust that I got from the sanding or from the dremeling, and I mixed it with some wood PVA glue just to make like a kind of makeshift wood filler, and I placed it on top in small layers, well, in big layers actually, to cover it. Now, one of my favorite parts in a project, well, rather tedious, is sanding. So after it dried, I sanded it, and actually I had idea. So I used this a screw that I put inside drilled inside the hole where the nail actually went through the circle, and I attached it onto my drill. And so I used that to my advantage, since it's a circular piece, which I don't work with often, just to even it out and just to make it a bit easier with the sanding. Here's a little compilation for the next pieces that I also sanded rather thoroughly with a medium grit sandpaper. Next up was the gluing process for the leg and the big cylinder. So I applied some quick setting wood PVA glue into each hole and inserted the legs inside, and then clamped them with rubber bands. And actually, before clamping anything, I pushed the legs down to ensure that they're flat with the floor, so that they're not angled, and that once it sets, that's how it'll be. And I placed the cylinder using probably a small amount of double-sided tape just to hold it down and to set the pieces all together. And with the rubber bands holding it together, I waited for the glue to set. And here it is. It's all dried, holds together. The top circle fits well. The only reason you can see those things rotating is just because of the screws. You know, it's not held super tight, but that's fine because it'll be going downwards anyway. And as you can see, the homemade wood filler that I made has turned into this ugly kind of gray black, and the texture isn't as great. And so I sanded it a little bit just because it doesn't look as nice, but at least it fills up, and it was an interesting experiment. Now the final part of the build would be to figure out how to stick this circle on top of that little area that's over there. So I thought of using some kind of dowel or a screw to place it inside, but I figured that would probably, well, take time, would be complicated, and it would be, I think, overkill, because anyway most of the force will be coming from the top. So I just glued it on top. I also applied some glue on the sides just so that it doesn't rotate, or, you know, for extra stability, since I'm not attaching it with anything else. So with those side parts of the glue sticking out, I wiped it all off, and I clamped it just using one simple clamp, since it's a nice vertical joint, making sure to use cardboard for this tough side, well, for the side that's actually going to be visible, so that it doesn't leave a mark, because that happened a few times, and that still applies enough pressure to hold it for sure. And it was left to dry. And here's the final result. I don't unfortunately have any video to show how I took it out and everything, but that's how it looks like. It holds well. This is actually a long time after I made it, and it still works. There's been no issues. I didn't have to repair anything, and it looks great, and it supports small pots.